The bitter December wind of 1967 howled across the Nebraska plains like a freight train, rattling the corrugated tin roof of a makeshift workshop where the amber glow of a single bare bulb cut through the darkness. Inside, Robert "Bob" Henderson, 37, his calloused hands black with 20 years of honest grease and his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air, carefully adjusted the carburetor on his 1947 Farmall M tractor. The rhythmic metallic clanking of his wrench echoed against the concrete walls like a blacksmith's hammer, while outside, snow piled against frost-covered windows in drifts that would challenge any man's resolve. The workshop smelled of motor oil, old leather, and the kind of honest work that built America's heartland. Bob's tools, inherited from his father and worn smooth by decades of use, lay scattered across a workbench made from rough-hewn oak planks. Each tool had a story, each scratch and dent a testament to problems solved and challenges overcome. This wasn't just maintenance, this was a ritual, a communion between man and machine that modern farmers were rapidly abandoning. Outside, cutting through the winter silence like a blade, came the distant rumble of a brand-new John Deere 4020, its diesel engine purring with the confidence that only $37,500 worth of financing could provide. Bob paused in his work, listening as his neighbor headed home after another day of work with equipment that cost more than Bob's entire 320-acre farm was worth. The sound faded into the distance, leaving only the wind and the steady tick of cooling metal. But here's what separated Bob Henderson from every other farmer in Custer County that winter, and here's why his story matters more today than ever before. While his neighbors were lining up at First National Bank to sign their names to $75,000 equipment loans that would haunt them for the next decade, Bob was rebuilding his future with nothing more than his own two hands, his father's tools, and a philosophy that would prove more valuable than any piece of modern machinery. You see, Bob understood something that the agricultural revolution of the 1960s had convinced most farmers to forget: there's a profound difference between owning something and making payments on something. And that difference, as we'll discover, would mean the distinction between building a legacy and losing everything when the worst agricultural crisis in American history finally arrived. Bob wiped his hands on an oil-stained rag that had seen more honest work than most men see in a lifetime, and stepped back to admire his evening's progress. The Farmall M, now 20 years old and showing every day of its hard-earned age, didn't look like much compared to the parade of shiny new tractors that had been rolling through Custer County all year. Its red paint was faded to the color of dried blood, its seat worn smooth and comfortable by 2 decades of 12-hour days, and its engine required the kind of intimate knowledge that only came from countless hours of maintenance, repair, and what Bob's father had called mechanical courtship. But this old tractor had something that those gleaming new machines rolling off the dealer lots didn't have, something that couldn't be financed, couldn't be depreciated, and couldn't be repossessed. It was completely, utterly, and forever paid for. Every bolt, every bearing, every drop of oil in its crankcase belonged to Bob Henderson, free and clear of any obligation to any bank, any dealer, or any other human being on earth. The Henderson farm had been in the family since 1923, when Bob's father, William, had purchased 320 acres of prime Nebraska farmland for $45 per acre, a price that seemed astronomical at the time but would prove to be one of the shrewdest investments in the county's history. William Henderson was a man who believed in exactly two things with religious fervor: hard work that started before sunrise and ended after sunset, and avoiding debt the way other men avoided rattlesnakes. When William passed away in the spring of 1965, his heart finally giving out after 42 years of wrestling a living from the unforgiving Nebraska soil, he left Bob not just the land, but something far more valuable, a philosophy that would prove more precious than any inheritance. "Son," William had said during one of their last conversations, his weathered hands gripping Bob's shoulders with surprising strength, "remember this until the day you die: equipment that's paid for works for you. Equipment that's financed works against you. The bank doesn't care if it rains, doesn't care if the corn don't grow, doesn't care if you're sick or hurt or broke. The bank just wants its money, every month, like clockwork, until you're either rich enough to pay it or poor enough to lose everything trying." Those words echoed in Bob's mind as he locked up his workshop that December evening, the sound of another neighbor's new tractor rumbling across the frozen fields like distant thunder. The Miller brothers, whose farm bordered his to the east, had just taken delivery of not one, but two brand new John Deere 4020s, along with a complete set of implements that gleamed like jewelry under the dealer's showroom lights. The total package, financed over 7 years at 8.5% interest, came to exactly $75,000, enough money in 1967 to buy 3 average farms outright, or to send 15 kids to college, or to live comfortably for a decade without working a single day. But the Miller brothers weren't thinking about alternatives. They were thinking about efficiency, about productivity, about keeping up with the agricultural revolution that was sweeping across the Midwest like a technological tornado. They were thinking about the future, about progress, about everything except the monthly payment book that would arrive in their mailbox like a recurring nightmare for the next 7 years. The next morning brought the kind of crystalline winter day that made Nebraska farmers grateful for heated cabs, a luxury that Bob's farm decidedly, emphatically, and completely lacked. As he fired up the old tractor, its engine turning over with the reliable rhythm of a machine that had been properly maintained and lovingly cared for, he could see the Miller brothers already at work in the distance, their new equipment cutting through the frozen ground with the kind of ease that only modern hydraulics and 100-horsepower engines could provide. The contrast was impossible to ignore. While Bob's farm coughed and wheezed in the cold, requiring several minutes of patient coaxing before it would consent to run smoothly, the Miller brothers' new John Deeres started instantly, their heated cabs protecting them from the brutal Nebraska wind that cut through Bob's canvas coat like it was made of tissue paper. But Bob had learned something during his 20 years of farming that his neighbors were about to discover the hard way: comfort comes with a price, and that price isn't always measured in dollars. Sometimes it's measured in freedom, in independence, in the ability to sleep soundly at night without worrying about payments that never end. At the monthly meeting of the Custer County Farmers Cooperative, held in the basement of the Lutheran Church where the smell of coffee and cigarette smoke mixed with the lingering aroma of last Sunday's potluck dinner, the conversation inevitably turned to equipment. The room buzzed with talk of horsepower and hydraulics, of financing options and trade-in values, of productivity gains and efficiency improvements. It was the kind of conversation that had been happening in farming communities across America for the past 5 years, as agriculture underwent the most dramatic transformation in its history. Bob sat quietly in the back, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, listening to his neighbors discuss their new purchases with the enthusiasm of children on Christmas morning. There was something almost religious about the way they talked about their equipment, as if these machines were not just tools but salvation itself, mechanical messiahs that would deliver them from the drudgery of traditional farming into a promised land of push-button agriculture. "Bob, you still running that old farm?" The voice belonged to Jim Miller, and it carried across the room with just enough volume to ensure that everyone in the basement heard every word. "Hell, that thing's older than my youngest boy. When you gonna join the modern age and get yourself some real equipment?" The room fell silent with the kind of uncomfortable quiet that descends when someone says something that everyone is thinking but nobody wants to acknowledge. 23 pairs of eyes turned toward Bob, waiting for his response, measuring his reaction, judging his choices. He could feel the weight of their collective assumption that his reluctance to modernize was somehow a character flaw, a failure to embrace progress, a stubborn adherence to outdated ways that had no place in the new world of scientific agriculture. "She runs fine," Bob replied simply, his voice steady despite the heat rising in his cheeks and the way his hands wanted to clench into fists. "Gets the work done. Gets the work done." Jim's brother, Paul, laughed with the kind of condescending chuckle that men use when they want to make someone feel small. "Bob, we can plant twice as fast as you, cultivate in half the time, and harvest with equipment that would make your old iron look like a child's toy. Time is money, friend. You're losing money every day you stick with that antique." What Paul Miller didn't mention, what he couldn't bring himself to say in front of his neighbors, was that his time-saving equipment came with monthly payments of $1,247, more than many farmers made in a good month, more than most families spent on groceries, housing, and clothing combined. He didn't talk about the sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling, worrying about making those payments, or the way his wife had started taking on extra work in town, cleaning houses and watching other people's children, just to help cover the insurance premiums on their new machines. He didn't mention the way his stomach knotted up every time he saw the payment book, or the constant pressure to maximize every acre, every bushel, every dollar just to keep the bank satisfied. He didn't talk about the fear that lived in the back of his mind like a persistent headache, the fear that one bad year, one drought, one drop in commodity prices could destroy everything he had worked for. Bob finished his coffee and stood to leave, pulling on his worn canvas coat that had seen more honest work than most men's Sunday suits. "Maybe so," he said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who slept well at night. "But my antique will still be running when your payments are done." The spring of 1968 brought an unexpected and brutal test of Bob's philosophy. A late-season storm swept across Nebraska in early May, arriving with the fury of nature unleashed and bringing with it hail the size of golf balls, winds that bent mature corn stalks to the ground, and the kind of destruction that reminded farmers just how small they really were in the grand scheme of things. When the weather cleared and the sun finally broke through the dissipating storm clouds, farmers across Custer County emerged from their houses and barns to assess the damage, and discovered that the storm had been particularly hard on modern equipment. The sophisticated machines that had been designed for efficiency and productivity had not been designed to withstand the kind of punishment that Mother Nature could dish out without warning. The Miller brothers' new John Deeres, with their complex hydraulic systems and sensitive electronic components, had suffered significant damage. Hail had cracked windshields, dented hoods, and somehow managed to find its way into electrical systems that had been sealed against dust and moisture but not against the fury of a Nebraska thunderstorm. The repair bills, when they finally arrived from the dealer, would total nearly $8,000, money the Miller brothers didn't have, money that would require them to take out additional loans just to get back in the field. Bob's Farmel M, parked in the same storm and subjected to the same punishment, had weathered the hail with nothing more than a few new dents in its already weathered hood and a cracked headlight that Bob replaced himself for $3.47. More importantly, when something did break on the old tractor, and things did break, because that's what machines do, Bob could fix it himself with basic tools and parts that cost dollars, not hundreds of dollars. The difference wasn't just financial, though the financial implications were staggering. The difference was philosophical, psychological, spiritual even. When Bob's tractor broke down, it was an inconvenience. When the Miller brothers' equipment failed, it was a crisis that threatened their entire operation. As summer progressed and the true cost of modernization began to reveal itself like a slow-developing photograph, the Miller brothers found themselves working longer hours than ever before, not because their machines weren't efficient, but because they had to maximize every acre, every bushel, every dollar just to keep up with their payments. They had become slaves to their own equipment, prisoners of their own progress. Bob, meanwhile, maintained his steady pace, working his land with the rhythm of a man who understood that farming was not a sprint but a marathon. His Farmel might have been slower, but it was reliable, and more importantly, it was his. When the day's work was done, he could shut it off and walk away without worrying about monthly payments, insurance premiums, or repair bills that could bankrupt a family. The contrast became even more stark during harvest season, when the pressure to get crops out of the field reached its annual crescendo. While his neighbors rushed to harvest their corn and soybeans, driven by the relentless pressure of loan payments and the fear of missing a single day of good weather, Bob worked at a measured pace that his father would have recognized and approved of. His equipment might have been older, but it was maintained to perfection, and he knew every bolt, every bearing, every potential point of failure. When something went wrong, and in farming, something always goes wrong, Bob could diagnose the problem, fix it, and get back to work without calling a dealer, without waiting for parts, without paying labor charges that could eat up a week's worth of profit. One evening in late September, as the sun set over fields of golden corn that stretched to the horizon like a sea of prosperity, Bob stood in his workshop, once again working on his Farmel. This time, he was performing routine maintenance, changing oil, greasing fittings, adjusting belts, replacing worn parts before they could fail. It was work that his neighbors paid mechanics to do, work that cost them hundreds of dollars every few months and required them to schedule appointments weeks in advance. But for Bob, these evening sessions in his workshop were more than just maintenance. They were an investment in independence, a guarantee that when spring came, his equipment would be ready. They were also a form of meditation, a way of staying connected to the mechanical heart of his operation, a reminder that farming was still, at its core, about the relationship between man and machine and land. As he worked, Bob could hear the sound of the Miller brothers' equipment in the distance, running late into the night under the harsh glare of floodlights. They were pushing their machines hard, trying to maximize their return on investment, trying to justify the enormous debt they had taken on. But Bob knew something they were beginning to learn: equipment doesn't care about your payment schedule, and the land doesn't respect your debt obligations. The winter of 1968–69 was particularly harsh, with temperatures dropping below zero for weeks at a time and snow that seemed to fall every other day. While his neighbors' new tractors sat in heated sheds, protected from the elements by expensive buildings that required their own financing, Bob's farm sat in his simple workshop, where he continued his routine of maintenance and improvement. During those long winter months, when the land lay frozen and dormant under a blanket of snow, Bob didn't just maintain his equipment, he rebuilt it. He pulled the engine, replaced worn parts, upgraded components that had been giving him trouble. He machined new parts when he couldn't buy them, fabricated solutions to problems that the original designers had never anticipated. By the time spring arrived, his 1947 Farmall was running better than it had in years, and Bob had invested nothing more than his time and a few $100s in parts. More importantly, he had invested in knowledge, in understanding, in the kind of intimate familiarity with his equipment that no amount of money could buy. The true test of Bob's philosophy came in the early 1970s, when a combination of drought, falling commodity prices, and rising interest rates began to squeeze farmers across the Midwest like a vice. The Miller brothers, like many of their neighbors, found themselves caught in a trap of their own making. Their loan payments remained constant while their income fluctuated wildly with weather and market conditions. When corn prices dropped from $1.50 per bushel to $1.10, the Miller brothers still owed $1,247 every month. When drought reduced their yields by 30%, they still owed $1,247 every month. When their new equipment broke down during the critical harvest season, requiring expensive repairs and causing costly delays, they still owed $1,247 every month. Bob, with no equipment payments to worry about, was able to weather the downturn with the kind of flexibility that debt destroys. When prices were low, he could afford to hold his grain, waiting for better markets. When drought reduced his yields, he didn't face the additional pressure of making payments on equipment that wasn't earning its keep. When his old Farmall needed repairs, he could fix it himself without breaking the bank. But the real crisis was yet to come. The late 1970s brought inflation that made everything more expensive except farm commodities, interest rates that climbed toward 20%, and a farm economy that was beginning to show serious cracks. Farmers who had borrowed heavily during the good times of the early 1970s found themselves facing a perfect storm: falling land values, rising interest rates, and commodity prices that couldn't keep pace with their debt obligations. The Miller brothers, who had continued to upgrade their equipment throughout the decade, now owed more than $200,000 on machinery alone. Their monthly payments had grown to nearly $3,000, and with corn selling for less than it cost to produce, they were facing a crisis that would ultimately cost them everything they had worked for. Bob, meanwhile, continued his routine. Every winter, he would tear down his equipment, rebuild what needed rebuilding, and prepare for another season. His Farmall M, now over 30 years old, was still running strong, still getting the work done, still earning its keep without demanding monthly tribute to distant bankers who had never felt Nebraska soil between their fingers. The agricultural crisis of the 1980s hit rural Nebraska like a tsunami, destroying everything in its path with the indiscriminate fury of economic forces beyond any individual farmer's control. Banks that had been eager to lend money for equipment purchases just a few years earlier were now foreclosing on farms across the state with the mechanical efficiency of a harvesting machine. The Miller brothers, despite their modern equipment and efficient operations, were among the casualties. Their farm, along with their $200,000 worth of machinery, was sold at auction in the spring of 1983, on a day when the wind carried the smell of fresh-turned earth and the promise of another growing season that they would not be part of. Bob attended that auction, not to bid, but to witness the end of a philosophy that had dominated farming for nearly 2 decades. As he watched the Miller brothers' equipment sell for pennies on the dollar, he thought about his father's words: equipment that's paid for works for you. Equipment that's financed works against you. The irony was not lost on him. The very equipment that was supposed to make farming more profitable, more efficient, more modern, had ultimately destroyed the farms it was meant to save. The Miller brothers, despite having access to the most advanced, efficient machinery available, had lost everything because they had confused ownership with debt, progress with payments, success with leverage. As the 1980s progressed and the farm crisis deepened, claiming family farms like a plague, Bob's approach began to look less like stubborn traditionalism and more like prescient wisdom. While his neighbors struggled with debt payments that consumed every dollar of profit and then some, Bob was able to not only survive but actually expand his operation, purchasing land from distressed neighbors at prices that reflected the harsh reality of the farm economy. By 1985, Bob owned 640 acres, double the size of his original farm, and every acre was paid for. His equipment, while still older than what his neighbors had been using, was perfectly suited to his operation and completely debt-free. He had proven that in agriculture, as in life, the tortoise really could beat the hare, and that sometimes the old ways were the best ways. The lesson of Bob Henderson's story extends far beyond the boundaries of Custer County, Nebraska, far beyond the world of agriculture, far beyond the specific circumstances of the 1970s and 1980s. In an age where debt is often seen as a tool for growth, where leverage is considered smart business, where the pressure to modernize and upgrade and finance is constant and overwhelming, Bob's story reminds us that there is profound power in ownership, real ownership, free and clear of any obligation to anyone else. Today, as farmers face new pressures to modernize, to adopt precision agriculture, to invest in GPS-guided tractors and computer-controlled planters and technology that promises greater efficiency and higher profits, Bob's story serves as both inspiration and cautionary tale. The fundamental question remains the same: does the equipment work for you, or do you work for the equipment? The answer, as Bob Henderson proved over the course of 4 decades of farming, can mean the difference between building a legacy and losing everything. In the end, the farmer who spent his winters rebuilding didn't just keep his land, he kept his freedom, his independence, and his dignity. And in a world where those things are increasingly rare, that might be the most valuable lesson of all. Like, share, and subscribe to the channel, activating notifications to be notified when new videos are published. God bless you.